In 1938, with the treaties that had restrained construction starting to fracture, the U.S. began designing two new classes of carriers. One was for a large carrier free of treaty limits that would become the post-war Midway class. The other was for a smaller 27,500-ton carrier, which was basically an improved Yorktown class to speed construction. This improved Yorktown class grew in length, beam, weight, and protection once the treaties collapsed totally at the start of the war to become the 31,000-ton Essex Class. At first, only a single ship was to be built, but with the start of World War II, two more were added. Once France fell and the Battle of Britain started, 8 more were added as the U.S. faced the very real possibility of soon having to fight Japan and Germany alone. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor, another 2 were ordered. As the war went on in 1942 and 43, another 13 were added for a total of 26. In 1945, 6 more were ordered, but these were soon canceled as the war neared its end, as were the last 2 of the 13. 14 Essexes fought in World War II, with 3 more just missing action and 7 commissioning after the war. Originally planned to begin entering service in 1944, once the war started, construction was sped up. As a result, these ships didn't commission serially, but rather as fast as they could be built. The most obvious change over the Yorktowns was the redesigning of the island and the addition of 2 twin 5-inch 38 caliber dual-purpose gun turrets on either end. This allowed the starboard deck edge 5-inchers of the Yorktowns to be omitted. This in turn allowed the starboard side of the flight deck to be widened by omitting the cutouts in the deck. This in turn allowed the larger deck park, especially during takeoff and landings. It also meant the island could be moved further out, giving the flight deck a straighter run. A smaller funnel and moving the ready rooms to between the flight deck and hangar also allowed the island to be smaller, increasing the usable flight deck area even more. Needless to say, the larger dimensions also meant a larger flight deck. The deck guns themselves allowed a larger field of fire. As well as firing to starboard, they could fire over the bow and stern, or even add their weight to the port side 5-inchers. Yes, this threatened any aircraft on the flight deck, but if an enemy got within range, there were bigger concerns than the planes caught on the deck. Light and medium anti-aircraft was also considerably improved in numbers. Compounding their effectiveness was the fitting of the Mark 37 directors on either end of the island, the fire control computers, and the proximity fuses that made them even more lethal. These ships also boasted from the start a combat information center where it could all be controlled. Operationally, probably the most useful change was the fitting of a full-sized deck-edge elevator which could fold upward. This was a far cry from Wasp's anemic derrick near the bow. It could lift multiple aircraft at a time. Its placement was key. Being fitted midship meant it was useful in both landing and launching aircraft. Since there no longer needed to be a giant hole in the flight deck, takeoffs or landings could carefully continue even as planes were moved between the flight deck and hangar. The scale of deck protection, again below the hangar, was improved by adding a second armored deck to protect the ship's vitals. In the engine room, the machinery was rearranged by adopting the unit principle of alternating boiler rooms and turbine compartments to make it more survivable. The TDS was also longer and deeper to increase survivability against torpedoes. Airplane fuel and aircraft weapons capacity also increased even as their protection grew. Even within the class itself, though, there was differences, some major, some minor. The largest of these changes was the long-haul ships, sometimes called the Ticonderoga class. Essentially, this entailed lengthening the bow 18 feet and shrinking the front end of the flight deck 18 feet. By doing so, 36 feet was opened on the bow for more medium and anti-aircraft guns. Except Bonhomme Richard, all of the ships started in 1943 and later were long-hauled. Another running change throughout the class was in catapults, especially in the early ones. Essex herself was completed with no catapults at all to speed construction. Yorktown, Intrepid, Hornet, Lexington, Bunker Hill, and Wasp were all completed with only a starboard side flight deck catapult. The rest were completed with both a starboard and port catapult. A hangar deck level catapult located port side just rear of the forward elevator was also originally fitted to most early ships. Yorktown, Intrepid, Hornet, Franklin, Bunker Hill, and Wasp all had them before it was realized how useless it was. The rest never got them. Essex was started April 28, 1941 and finished December 31, 1942. Yorktown, originally Bonhomme Richard, was started December 1, 1941 and finished April 15, 1943. Intrepid was started December 1, 1941 and finished August 16, 1943. Hornet, originally Kearsarge, was started in earnest August 3, 1942 and finished November 29, 1943. Franklin was started December 7, 1942 and finished January 31, 1944. Ticonderoga, originally Hancock, was started March 1, 1943 and finished May 8, 1944. Randolph was started May 10, 1943 and finished October 9, 1944. Lexington, originally Cabot, was started July 15, 1941 and finished February 17, 1943. Bunker Hill was started September 15, 1941 and finished May 24, 1943. Wasp, originally Oriskany, was started March 18, 1942 and finished November 24, 1943. Hancock, originally Ticonderoga, was started January 26, 1943 and finished April 15, 1944. Bennington was started December 15, 1942 and finished August 6, 1944. Boxer was started September 13, 1943 and finished April 16, 1945. Bonhomme Richard was started February 1, 1943 and finished November 26, 1944. Leyte, originally Crown Point, was started February 21, 1944 and completed April 11, 1946. Kearsarge was started March 1, 1944 and completed March 2, 1946. Oriskany was started May 1, 1944 and finally completed September 25, 1950 to a much modified design. Reprisal was started July 1, 1944 but canceled August 11, 1945 when 52% complete. Antietam was started March 15, 1943 and completed January 28, 1945. Princeton, originally Valley Forge, was started September 14, 1943 and completed November 18, 1945. Shangri-La was started January 15, 1943 and completed September 15, 1944. Lake Champlain was started March 15, 1943 and completed June 2, 1945. Tarawa was started January 5, 1944 and completed December 8, 1945. Valley Forge was started September 7, 1944 and completed November 3, 1946. Iwo Jima was started January 29, 1945 but canceled August 11, 1945 after minimal work. Philippine Sea, originally Wright, was started August 19, 1944 and completed May 11, 1946. CVs 50 through 55 were all canceled March 28, 1945 without work starting or even being named. Main armament was 12 5-inch 38 caliber dual-purpose guns, 8 in 4 twin turrets, 2 on either end of the island. The remaining 4 were in single open mounts, a pair near each port end of the flight deck. Propulsion was provided by 8 boilers venting to the island funnel. These provided steam to 4 turbines that generated 154,000 horsepower. Being direct drive, each turbine drove one of the ship's 4 propellers for a top speed of 33 knots. Again, they used one rudder. Protection improved on the Yorktowns. Side armor was 4 inches midship, tapering down to 2.5 inches. 4-inch bulkheads closed off the ends of the armored box, protecting the ship's vitals in the main hull. Again, the flight deck was not armored, but the hangar deck floor was 2.5 inches, with an additional 1.5-inch deck the next level down. The machinery adopted the unit principle. The forward fire room was divided into 4 quadrants, each with a boiler in it. Next came the forward engine room that housed the 2 turbines that ran the outer shafts. Following this was 2 more fire rooms, each with 2 boilers. Last came the rear engine room that carried the 2 turbines that drove the inner shafts. The TDS was mostly 4 layers thick, with the outer 2 layers liquid-filled. They were triple-bottomed. The flight deck on the short-hauled ships was 862 feet by 108 feet. On the long-hauled ships, this was shortened to 844 feet by 108 feet. As stated, Yorktown, Intrepid, Hornet, Lexington, Bunker Hill, and Wasp were all completed with only a flight deck catapult. Except Essex, the rest were completed with both a starboard and port catapult. There were 3 elevators, 2 centerline, 1 near the bow, and 1 just aft of midship, that were 48 by 44 feet each. The third was a midship port side deck edge elevator that was 60 feet by 34 feet. The hangar was 654 feet long by 70 feet wide by 17.5 feet high, and ran from the forward elevator to the open stern. In front of the hangar was 3 levels of aircraft's workshops. Again, aircraft could be hung from the ceiling for storage. Yorktown, Intrepid, Hornet, Franklin, Bunker Hill, and Wasp had hangar deck catapults. Aircraft complement was generally between 90 and 100. Generally, to begin with, this was 2 squadrons of fighters, 2 squadrons of dive bombers, and a squadron of torpedo planes. As 1945 rolled around and the threat of enemy surface ships was replaced by the kamikaze, this was reorganized to about 70 fighters, 15 dive bombers, and 15 torpedo planes. When operating as a dedicated night carrier, air group size dropped to about 2 squadrons of fighters and 1 of torpedo planes, a telling indication of the inherent risk of landing planes in the dark. Modifications were fairly typical for World War II ships. In 1944, the bow arresting gear was removed from ships that already had them. More and better light and medium anti-aircraft was added. Better radar, communications, and command and control was fitted. Starting in June of 1944, as ships carrying them came in for refit or repair, the hangar deck catapult was removed. Starting with Lexington in late 1943, ships that only had 1 flight deck catapult had a second added as they came in for refit or repair. Essex got both in April of 1944. Post-war, these ships were extensively altered under the SCB programs. Essex joined the Pacific Fleet in May of 1943 and began training. Now joined by Yorktown, their first combat missions were training raids for their pilots against the Japanese-held islands of Marcus in late August, and with the addition of Lexington, Wake in early October. With the newly arrived Bunker Hill, Essex then took part in the raid on Rubal in early November. Getting down to business, in mid-November they covered the invasion of the Gilberts for the rest of the year. Off Kwajalein on December 4th, Lexington was hit well aft of an aircraft torpedo that badly damaged her steering gear and caused her to trim down by the stern. Repairs at the west coast would last until late February of 1944. In January of 1944, now joined by Intrepid, they covered the invasion of the Marshalls, including the mid-February raid on Truk and the following raid on the Marianas. On the evening of February 17th, during the first day of the Truk raid, Intrepid was hit by an aircraft torpedo that damaged her rudder. Repairs would keep her out of the war until early September. Hornet's arrival, along with the return of Lexington in mid-March, allowed Essex to return to the west coast for overhaul, while her sisters supported the drive up the coast of New Guinea. Starting in June, now joined by Wasp, and with Essex back, they covered the liberation of the Marianas and the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Franklin joined the fleet after the battle at the end of June. In the third quarter of 1944, they covered the invasion of the Palaus, while Yorktown went back to the west coast for an overhaul that would last until mid-November, her place being taken by the arrival of Hancock and the return of Intrepid. In October, they covered the liberation of the Philippines. This included the pre-invasion raids on Okinawa and Taiwan and the epic Battle of Leyte Gulf. Off Taiwan on October 15th, Franklin was hit by a bomb that struck her deck-edge elevator. The damage was superficial, though, this time. Shortly after Leyte, on October 29th, Ticonderoga joined the fleet. The next day, on October 30th, Franklin was hit by a kamikaze. It went right through her flight deck and started fires. Repairs would last until mid-March of 1945. On November 5th, Lexington was hit by a kamikaze, which badly damaged her island. Repairs would last 3 weeks. The next day, on November 6th, Bunker Hill headed to the west coast for overhaul. On November 25th, shortly after the return of Yorktown, Essex was hit by a kamikaze, sustaining damage that took 3 weeks to repair. That same day, Intrepid was hit by 2 kamikazes that also sent her back to the west coast until mid-March of 1945. The rest went on to cover the liberation of the northern Philippines into the start of 1945. This included raids into the South China Sea meant to destroy enemy aircraft in Indochina and hopefully catch any warships or merchants returning to Japan after Leyte or heading to the Philippines to reinforce the garrison there. On January 21st, Ticonderoga was hit by 2 kamikazes. The first crashed through her flight deck and exploded in the hangar, starting a large fire that was fed by fueled aircraft. The second hit the starboard side next to the island, adding to the blaze. Repairs at the west coast would last until late May. In February, now joined by Randolph and Bennington, and with Bunker Hill back, they covered the invasion of Iwo Jima, while Lexington went back to the west coast for overhaul that would last until June. While in port on March 11th, Randolph was hit by a kamikaze. Repairs there lasted 3 weeks. In March, with Franklin and Intrepid back, came raids on the Japanese home islands in preparation for the invasion of Okinawa. While doing so, on March 15th, Wasp was hit by a bomb which caused a large fire on 5 decks. On the 18th, Yorktown was hit by a bomb that blew 2 holes in her hull, lightly damaging her. Intrepid, only 5 days back, was so closely near-missed by a kamikaze that debris and fuel from the plane started a fire in her hangar. Franklin got hit the worst. On the morning of March 19th, she was hit by 2 bombs dropped by a low-flying plane that slipped through the combat air patrol. Both bombs penetrated her flight deck and exploded. Armed or fueled aircraft in her hangar and more on her flight deck added to the firestorm. Burning, listing 13 degrees due to water from firefighting, and with nearly a third of her crew killed, the most heavily damaged carrier to ever survive eventually sailed halfway around the world at 15 knots under her own power to the east coast. Despite being fully repaired well after the war, she never re-entered active service. At the start of April came the invasion of Okinawa. On April 7th, a kamikaze hit parked aircraft on Hancock, starting a large fire which sent her to Pearl Harbor for repairs through the end of June. On April 16th, a kamikaze hit Intrepid, starting fires in her hangar. Repairs to the Dry Eye would effectively keep her out of the rest of the war. Wasp, in the meantime, also headed to the west coast for repairs and overhaul that would last until mid-July, her place being taken by the arrival of Shangri-La in late April. On May 11th, Bunker Hill was hit by 2 kamikazes that detonated her armed and fueled aircraft. Heavily damaged, she sailed to the west coast under her own power, where she not only sat out the rest of the war, being fully repaired, but like Franklin, never returned to service. On June 4th, the fleet sailed into Typhoon Viper, a storm so strong it snapped the forward 25 feet of Hornet's flight deck, sending her back to the west coast for repairs that would last the rest of the war. Bennington was also lightly damaged. Bonhomme Richard joined the fleet while Lexington and Hancock returned. With the return of Wasp in late July and for the rest of the war, they took part in the final destruction of the Japanese fleet and pounding the home islands in preparation for Operation Downfall, the invasion of Japan. Boxer, Antietam, and Lake Champlain were commissioned during the war, but joined the fleet so late they didn't actually see any combat. The rest were commissioned after the war. With progressive and major modifications, all but Franklin and Bunker Hill served as the core of America's carrier fleet until replaced by today's supercarriers, at which time they were put in reserve and eventually most were scrapped. A few still survive today as museums, though none are in their World War II configuration. Yorktown at Patriots Point, South Carolina. Intrepid at the Sea Air Space Museum in New York City. Hornet at Alameda, California. And Lexington, who served until the early 90s as a training carrier at Corpus Christi, Texas.